Hi friends, today we're reading Charlie and the Chocolate Factory by Ronald Dahl. Chapter 10, The Family Begins to Starve. During the next 2 weeks, the weather turned very cold. First came the snow. It began very suddenly one morning just as Charlie Bucket was getting dressed for school. Standing by the window, he saw the huge flakes drifting slowly down out of the icy sky that was the color of steel. By evening, it lay 4 feet deep around the tiny house, and Mr. Bucket had to dig a path from the front door to the road. After the snow, there came a freezing gale that blew for days and days without stopping, and oh, how bitter cold it was. Everything that Charlie touched seemed to be made of ice, and every time he stepped outside the door, the wind was like a knife on his cheek. Inside the house, the little jets of freezing air came rushing in through the sides of the windows and under the doors, and there was no place to go to escape them. The four old ones lay silent and huddled in their beds, trying to keep the cold out of their bones. The excitement over the golden tickets had long since been forgotten. Nobody in the family gave a thought now to anything except the two vital problems of trying to keep warm and trying to get enough to eat. There is something about very cold weather that gives one an enormous appetite. Most of us find ourselves beginning to crave rich, steaming stews and hot apple pies, and all kinds of delicious warming dishes. And because we are all a great deal luckier than we realize, we usually get what we want, or near enough. But Charlie Bucket never got what he wanted because the family couldn't afford it. And as the cold weather went on, and he became desperately hungry, both bars of candy, the birthday one and the one Grandpa Joe had bought him, had long since been nibbled away, and all he got now were those thin, cabbagey meals 3 times a day. Then, all at once, the meals became even thinner. The reason for this was the toothpaste factory, the place where Mr. Bucket worked, suddenly went bust and had to close down. Quickly, Mr. Bucket tried to get another job, but he had no luck in the end. The only way in which he managed to earn a few pennies was by shoveling snow in the streets. But it wasn't enough to buy even a quarter of the food the 7 people needed to survive. The situation became desperate. Breakfast was a single slice of bread for each person now, and lunch was maybe half a boiled potato. Slowly but surely, everyone in the house began to starve. And every day, little Charlie Bucket trudged through the snow on his way to school. He would have to pass Mr. Wonka's great chocolate factory, and every day as he came near it, he would lift his small pointed nose high in the air and sniff the wonderful sweet smell of melting chocolate. Sometimes he would stand motionless outside the gates for several minutes on end, taking deep swallowing breath as though he were trying to eat the smell itself. "That child," said Grandpa Joe, poking his head up from under the blanket one icy morning, "that child has got to have more food." "It doesn't matter about us. We're too old to bother. But he's a growing boy. He can't go on like this. He's beginning to look like a skeleton. What can we do?" said Grandma Josephine miserably. "He refuses to take any of ours. I hear his mother tried to slip her own piece of bread onto his plate this morning, and he wouldn't touch it. He gave it back to her." "He's a fine little fellow," said Grandpa George. "He deserves better than this." The cruel weather went on, and every day Charlie Bucket grew thinner and thinner. His face became frighteningly white and pinched. The skin was drawn so tightly over his cheeks that you could see the shape of the bones underneath. It seemed doubtful whether he could go on much longer like this without becoming dangerously ill. And now, very calmly, with the cautious wisdom that seems to come so often with small children in times of hardship, he began to make little changes here and there in some of the things he did. So to save strength in the morning, he left 10 minutes earlier so he could walk slowly to school, without ever having to run. He sat quietly in the classroom during recess, resting himself while the others rushed outside to throw snowballs and rustled in the snow. Everything he did now, he did slowly and carefully to prevent exhaustion. Then one afternoon, walking back home with icy wind in his face, and incidentally feeling hungrier than ever, his eye was caught suddenly by a piece of paper that was lying in the gutter in the snow. The paper was a greenish color, and there was something vaguely familiar about it. Charlie stopped at the curb and bent down to examine it. Part of it was buried under the snow, and he saw what it was at once, a dollar bill. Quickly he looked around him. Had somebody just dropped it? No, that was impossible because of the way part of it was buried. Several people were hurrying past him on the sidewalks, their chins sunk deep in their collar coats and feet crunching in the snow. None of them was searching for any money. None of them was taking the slightest notice of the small boy crouching in the gutter. Then it was his, the dollar. Could he have it? Carefully, Charlie pulled it out from under the snow. It was damp and dirty, but otherwise perfect, a whole dollar. He held it tightly between his shivering fingers, gazing down at it. It meant one thing at that moment, only one thing. It meant food. Automatically, Charlie turned and began moving towards the nearest shop. It was only 10 paces away. It was a newspaper and stationery store. the kind that sells almost everything, including candy and cigars. And what would he do? He whispered to himself quietly. He would buy one luscious bar of candy, and he would eat it all, every bit, right then and there, and the rest of the money he would take straight home and give it to his mother. We're going to read chapter 11 too. Chapter 11, The Miracle. Charlie entered the store and laid the damp dollar bill on the counter. "One Wonka's Wimple Scrumpalicious Fudge Mellow Delight," he said, remembering how much he loved that one on his birthday. The man behind the counter looked fat and well fed. He had big lips and fat cheeks and a very fat neck. The fat around his neck bulged out all around the top of his collar like a rubber ring. He turned and reached behind him for the candy bar, and then he turned back and handed it to Charlie. Charlie grabbed it and quickly tore off the wrapper and took an enormous bite. Then he took another and another. Oh, the joy of being able to cram large pieces of something sweet and solid into one's mouth. The sheer blissful joy of being able to fill one's mouth with rich, solid food. "You look like you wanted that one, Sonny," the shop owner said pleasantly. Charlie nodded. He began bulging with chocolate. The shopkeeper put Charlie's change on the counter. "Take it easy," he said. "You'll give yourself a stomachache if you swallow it like that without chewing." Charlie went on wolfing down the candy. He couldn't stop. And in less than half a minute, the whole thing had disappeared down his throat. He was quite out of breath, but he felt marvelous, extraordinary happy. He reached out of his hand to take the change. Then he paused. His eyes were just above the level of the counter, and he was staring at the little silver coins laying there. The coins were all dimes, and there were 9 of them. Surely it wouldn't matter if he spent just one more. "I think," he said quietly, "I think I'll just have one more of those candy bars." "The same one as before, please." "Why not?" said the shopkeeper, reaching behind him and grabbing another Wimple Scrumpalicious Fudge Mellow Delight. He laid it on the counter. Charlie picked it up and tore off the wrapper, and suddenly, from underneath the wrapper, there was a brilliant flash of gold. Charlie's heart stood still. "It's a golden ticket!" screamed the shopkeeper, leaping up with a foot in the air. "Hey, you've got a golden ticket! He found the last golden ticket! Hey, what do you know? Come on, look at this, everybody! This kid's found Wonka's last golden ticket! There it is! It's right there in his hands." It seemed as though the shopkeeper might be going to have a fit. "In my shop, too," he yelled. "He found it right there in my own little shop. Somebody call the newspapers, quick, and let them know. You know what, Sonny? Don't tear it. Don't unwrap it. That thing's precious." In a few seconds, there was a crowd of about 20 people clustering around Charlie, and many more were pushing their way into the street. Everybody wanted to get a look at the golden ticket and the lucky finder. "Where is it?" somebody shouted. "Hold it up so we can all see it." "There it is," someone shouted. "He's holding it in his hands. See the gold shining? How did he manage to find that? And find it, I'd like to know," a large voice shouted. 20 bars a day! I've been buying for weeks and weeks. Think of all the free stuff he'll be getting too," another boy said enviously. "A lifetime supply. He'll need it, that skinny little kid," a girl said. Charlie hadn't moved. He hadn't even unwrapped the golden ticket from the candy bar. He was standing very still, holding it tightly with both hands while the crowd pushed and shouted all around him. He felt quite dizzy. There was a peculiar floating sensation coming all over him, as though he were floating up in the air like a balloon. His feet didn't seem to be touching the ground at all. He couldn't hear his heart thumping as loudly as though there was something in his throat. And at that point, he became aware of a hand resting lightly on his shoulder. And when he looked up, he saw a tall man standing over him. Listen, the man said. "I'll buy it from you. I'll give you $50. How about it, eh? And I'll give you a new bicycle as well, okay?" "Are you crazy?" shouted a woman who was standing close nearby. "Well, I'd give you $500. Why would you sell that ticket? Would you sell that ticket for $500? That's quite enough of that," the fat shopkeeper said, shouting by pushing his way through the crowd and taking Charlie by the arm. "Leave the kid alone, will you? Make way there. Let him out." And to Charlie, as he led him through the door, he whispered, "Don't you let anybody have that. You take that straight home quickly before you lose it. Run all the way home and don't stop till you get there. You understand?" Charlie nodded. "You know something," the fat shopkeeper said, pausing for a moment and smiling at Charlie. "I have a good feeling you needed a break like this. I'm awfully glad you got it. Good luck to you, Sonny." "Thank you," said Charlie, as he went off running through the snow as fast as his legs would go. And although he flew past Wonka's factory, he turned and waved and sang out, "I'll be seeing you soon!" And 5 minutes later, he arrived at his own house.